Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Republica, for having me. I'll just have a quick talk on this issue, and then we can do some questions at the end. Perhaps a good place to start is colonization. I know it's a big word, and it's a very scary word. It's an evil word, but I think it does us good to just take a moment and remember our past. I mean, that's why we celebrate Independence Day. We teach these things in school to make sure we don't repeat our past. If you remember the hallmarks of colonization, or if you've studied anything about it, it was always resources first, this need for resources and for cheap labor, and not getting it democratically, but getting it through exploitation, right? And then these African leaders who collaborated to betray people into slavery, and countries that made wicked amounts of money, filthy rich from that process, while the countries that were left in abject poverty just from that process. In a nutshell, to oversimplify things, I mean, that's really what it was about. And then now, shoot to our current present, this brave new world of ours, the digital world, our digital future. We have new masters now. We have tech companies and big tech companies. Some make more in a quarter than a lot of countries' entire GDP. And the money is unequitably distributed. But I mean, there's an English saying about it: whoever pays the piper calls the tune. Again, we see the same patterns. There's a need for resources. There's a tech race to get more devices into people's hands, the newest version of the iPhone and the Tesla. And they all need cobalt, for example. So let me tell you about Congo. And the first thing I'll tell you about it is to look up the decision by the federal court in the US that was earlier, a few months ago actually, where the federal court in the US has just dismissed a case that was brought by young people, young children from Congo, who were forced to work in the mines. Some who lost their lives and had to be represented by their families before the court. You see, somewhere in this race for more devices and newer devices, and somewhere along the supply chain for Apple, for Google, for Tesla, young children have been made to work in the mines, and that comes at a cost. No safe work, but then also loss of lives. But again, stop all that. Why are children working to begin with? Why is poverty so bad that it's pushing people to do that on their own land? I mean, forget about the resources angle. Let's talk about the labor, cheap labor. Big tech needs labor. There's no doubt about that. Does big tech need cheap labor? Does big tech need exploitative labor? I'll tell you about South Africans, Nigerians, Burundians, Ethiopians, Somalis, Tanzanians, and Kenyans. This is a group of people I've come to know quite closely, and their story is quite heartbreaking. You see, these are different people from different parts of Africa. I want you to imagine the map from the northwest, south, and east, yet they share a common story. A lot of them new graduates from either high school or university were recruited in what feels like a hunt. When you're hunting for poor people to give them a life, a better life, and that's in very big quotes. They're online looking for jobs. They want to make it out of poverty. They really want to make something out of their lives. And there's this push the world over that tech is the future and digital jobs are the future. And everybody's applying, but nobody has any idea what they're applying for, because that's by design. And a lot of these people were applying for administrative jobs or accounting jobs or ticketing jobs online, called very weird things like sales, online sales, or online monitoring. And they're so excited, they bargain for salary knowing this, and the company brings them to Kenya. And the first thing they land in Kenya is slapped with an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, and it's like, you cannot talk about what you're about to see. We didn't tell you what you're going to see, but you can't talk about it from now henceforth. And then you start work, and it's content moderation. Oh, scratch that. It's not content moderation. It's Facebook content moderation. That means something. That's something those people should have been told before they left their homes. Somebody should have said, you're coming to do incredibly important work, but this work is going to affect your mental health in a way you have never imagined. Here's your choice. Choose if you want to come and do this job. Here are the measures we will put in place to protect you, and should something happen to you, we will take care of you. Nobody said that. And I have really struggled with this issue, because when you look at international standards and the ILO standards, to be specific, that looks like human trafficking for labor. Why couldn't you just tell people, young people who are so hopeful, you're coming to do this job? I mean, no surprise, 6 months in, sometimes even 3 months in, those young people are suffering from PTSD, from depression, from anxiety disorders. That's the reality of what exploitative labor looks like. And that's why those young people are in court. You see, I wish that was a unique story for Facebook. I wish that was a one-time thing and we get to say, oh, that's the bad guy. No. It's the same thing over and over. When you listen to TikTok content moderators, they tell you the same thing. When you listen to those who are moderating for the ChatGPT bot, they tell you the same thing. We had no idea what we were signing up for, but I may never hold another job. I may never leave my house because this is what the job has done to me. And then here's an antidote just to think about things. You would expect, I mean, if big tech's work is being done in the African continent, then Africa should benefit largely from this. But take a step back. Yes, in the AI world, we're excited, and it's this new world, and it's going to do these amazing, magical things, make life easier, make life predictable. Okay. Let's not forget where we were when it came to universal access. We had not achieved universal access to begin with, which then means a lot of critical voices were not online yet. So then, with AI, I mean, these people are being brought to Kenya to train algorithms, and algorithms need data. What data sets are being used? They are the existing data sets that we have, which already are excluding in their nature. So this is what you get in results, as a result. I'll tell you about the Ethiopians. So content moderation is happening in Kenya for content that is being shared in Ethiopia. Let's think about the Tigray war. The context here is, while for most of us, we've left the Facebook platform for our grandmothers and for our mothers, we've moved on to other platforms. In a country like Ethiopia, where there's internet shutdowns and there's a lot of restrictions and censorship, social media platforms like Facebook are the main source of news. People see it and they believe it because, again, digital literacy is at a very low level. So then people start to use this platform to dox people in the context of a war. And one such person, Abraham Meareg, is a professor minding his business, living his life. His colleagues decide to dox him on the Facebook platform and falsely accuse him of being part of the conflict. And his son, as any responsible son would, reports this post on Facebook and says, so many of these posts have been shared, and the pattern usually is, if someone gets doxed, in a few days, they get murdered. Please pull down this post. I mean, the algorithm is supposed to take care of these things, isn't it? The algorithm is supposed to know when there's a threat to life. It's supposed to pull it down. But the algorithm is trained in English, and the post is in Tigrayan. And the first line of defense returns, oh no, that's not offensive at all. Like, just let that stay up. And the human content moderators are called in, and then Kenya, then Nairobi, and they say this post is offensive. And Facebook says the community standards say it has to be offensive in English. So if you translate this post in English, is it offensive really? And they don't take it down, and Abraham was murdered. That's what happens when you don't invest in the front end and in the back end. Again, think about the South Africans. You would imagine for a country where WhatsApp is the main form of communication, I mean, we are bleeding data. I think South Africa is the best example of data colonization and how people have stood up to defend against it, to fight against it. So during COVID, I mean, there was a huge, huge need for governments to be able to communicate with their people, to be able to distribute relief. And the government in South Africa did come up with a good way to use WhatsApp, to tap into an already existing infrastructure, to not only communicate to people life-saving information, but also to distribute support that was necessary at that time. And Facebook says, no. IP, intellectual property, you cannot touch it. But the question is, but you use our data. You have benefited from our data. Why can't we use it? Not to make money, to save our people in the context of a pandemic. So we're training big tech. We're training the algorithm. We're at the bedrock of AI, but we don't get to benefit from it. How is that fair? But who's doing these things? It's big tech. It's big tech that's heavily present in Kenya and in Africa for the purposes of making a profit, but barely present for the purposes of being held accountable. We have 3 cases ongoing in Kenya, and in every single one of those cases against big tech, they have returned the same defense. You can't hold us accountable. I mean, we're an American company. You can't sue us in Kenya. But you make billions in this country. Your platforms literally run the framework of social political conversations, but somehow they cannot be held accountable. But it's not big tech alone. It's other American and European countries. Stay with me. Business process outsourcing companies. The collaborators, if this were colonialism, and it is, these are collaborators. They're not Kenyan companies, they're European companies. Teleperformance, that's a French company. Majorel, Luxembourg, these are European companies. These are not Kenyan deals, these are deals that are signed in America, in Europe. Sama, that's an American company. They sign these deals out of Kenya. And the BPO sets up a branch in Kenya and becomes the agent for the big tech company. So who's looking out for the Kenyan? But here's where the unholy matrimony becomes perfected, the governments. Everybody's in this race to make sure that the tech bus doesn't leave us. Everybody wants to be part of the action without really defining what action they want to be part of. And there's this obsession to make big tech happy so that they can invest in Africa. But the investment we're seeing is dumping jobs without decent work, decent working conditions, or decent pay. So then the irony here is, for our country, for example, for our Independence Day, the chief guests were big tech companies. That's just how this is embedded. But it's going to take for people to stand up and say, it doesn't have to be one or the other. Development doesn't have to happen at the cost of human rights. If you want labor in this country, inform people of the work they're coming to do, treat them fairly when they come here, and protect them from mental health harm. I'm reminded of, again, the South Africans who've taken Amazon's partner to court because Amazon wants to set up its headquarters in South Africa, and it decides to settle on indigenous land. And they take this to court. Unfortunately, they lose. But the question that leaves me with is, must it be one or the other? Do we not have a situation where we could have rights and development? Why must it be rights at the expense of big tech? Listen, I won't lie to you. Big tech is currently built on the broken backs and minds of African youth. These are some of the cases that are currently in court. I would encourage you to keep up with them and see how you can support them. But you may imagine this is an African problem, but in the profile I just read, I didn't mention a single African company. These are European companies, big tech, are American companies with European branches. And if advocacy is going to be successful, then it has to go to where they are. Responsibility has to be where these companies are located. The supply chain is bleeding in tangible ways, like in the example of Congo, and in intangible ways in the example of the content moderators. But myself and the other lawyers who are taking these cases to court, I believe that it doesn't have to be this way. Our digital future needs to be fair, it needs to be equitable. And that's why we're fighting back. Thank you. I'll give a moment in case anyone has any questions.
Any questions? No? Okay.
Okay.
No questions? Yeah.
Hi, Mercy. Thank you so much for sharing. I have a question. So you said that you were fighting back, and so my question is, are these case courts been brought up in African countries? And if the work you've been doing, you have been collaborating with other lawyers or organizations that might be based where these companies come from and doing like more concerted, I guess, bringing these cases to litigation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. So African lawyers have taken a varied approach. For the Congo scenario, they filed the case in the US. For the South African scenario, they filed the case in South Africa. So myself, involved in litigation against big tech that's doing content moderation and data labeling work in Kenya, and we filed those cases in Kenya. And we've had some success so far with the Kenyan court saying they can be held responsible in Kenya, despite the argument that they're American and European countries and they can't be sued in Kenya. In terms of collaboration, collaboration has become very important to us. You can't sue what you don't know. And we don't know. because there's a big barrier on IP and their secrets and their trade secrets. So we've had to partner with a legal organization based out of London, Foxglove Legal, on the research, but also have been very fortunate to get volunteer researchers, just send us information and send us recent. For example, in the Ethiopian case, Frances Hogan was very instrumental in giving us the Frances Hogan papers, which tell us how the algorithm works, but it's something we can produce to court and defend our cases. Yeah.
More questions?
There's a question here.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I would like to know a little bit more about the organization of content moderations in Kenya and other African countries. Can you tell us a little bit more? Because I know it was founded 1 year ago. So what are the actions? Are you collaborating with people in Europe or in other countries?
Yeah. So they've run into huge challenges, and one of the biggest challenges has been the court preserved their jobs. Once they went to court, the court said they shouldn't lose their jobs, let them continue staying in work. But big tech ignored the court orders. So we had a mass exit of content moderators from Kenya who had to lose their jobs to the redundancy as they wait for the court decision to come in. So that really slowed down organization efforts, but it has received a new boost because now the annotators and the data labelers have come forward to support the unionizing efforts. And those are far more than even the content moderators. We're talking about tens of thousands of workers. And one of their primary goals at this point is to get as many content moderators and annotators to join the union. So that's the efforts, that's where we're at. They do have a funding concern in terms of, these are young people who've never had jobs before, so unionizing needs capacity building, but then also organizing needs for them to understand how to do it and how to fight in a system where even the government doesn't quite support your efforts. So they do need support in that end, and I'm happy to connect you with the leaders of the union, but also of the annotators, so you can see how to support further. There's one more question over there.
Thanks for your sharing. I wonder, what do you think, why this happens so often in African countries? Is it due to the poor legislation or not so very elaborate legislation in terms of human rights in many countries you were referring to?
There is not one single answer to your question. There's many different reasons why. The first one is poverty. I mean, there are very high rates of poverty, and what's happening right now is very targeted recruiting of people who come from poor backgrounds. But that complicates things. If someone's coming from abject poverty, they're less likely to complain if working conditions are not as decent, and you're more likely to get away with exploiting their labor. So the legal question is only limited to new forms of harm. For example, our law doesn't yet recognize mental health harm as an occupational health hazard, but the law does say you should treat people fairly and have decent work. So the law has just a very small gap in terms of new age problems. The biggest problem we see is that the government has closed its eyes to what's happening. So that then we have a government that is negotiating heavily for big tech to continue dumping more jobs and is not really regulating, is not really opening the blind and asking what kinds of jobs are these, what are the mitigation measures, what are you doing to make sure that young people are protected from the harm that the work is causing. I think that's the biggest gap. So then that has pushed us to the situation we're in. Our only recourse is going to court and defending the workers. Court should be a last resort. In our case, it's the only resort because the government isn't really listening.
We have time for one more question. This side.
Hi, thank you very much for sharing. You mentioned the consequences of the exploitative labor on the young youth, like depression, PTSD. And I was just wondering, like, do they get any help? Like, it will affect their whole lives probably, and I fear the answer is no. But like, is there anything which is being done to help their mental health, and what should be done to mitigate the consequences of all this happening?
Thank you so much for asking that. The argument that big tech is creating jobs for young people falls because of exactly that. Is it really sustainable if they work for a short period of time and then cannot work anymore because they're suffering from mental health harm? I can personally say I represent around 400 clients, and consistently all of them complain about the same thing. They are not receiving mental health care at the moment because, for example, for the 200 who were laid off from Meta, their exit packages did not include access to psychiatrists or to psychologists. So they are waiting for the results of the case we have in court, because one of the things we're asking for the judge to do is order Meta to take them for proper psychiatric and psychological care. And for the rest, they have, the ones who are working, they have access to what they're calling wellness counseling, but these are not psychiatrists still, and it's ineffective access to mental health care, which we can only solve through policy advocacy and trying to get the government to do its job and hold these companies accountable. As for what can be done, we've tried over the past 2 years to just get them medical attention, and if that looks like people coming forward and paying for months' worth of therapy, that's what it will look like. We've not really had much success in that. It's quite difficult fundraising for mental health care, it seems, especially on the African continent, because these are not things that are usually talked about. Some of the workers I've interacted with haven't even told their parents what they were doing or what they're going through, because there's a lot of stigma that surrounds depression and mental health illnesses, unfortunately. It appears that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for spending time with me and for listening to this talk. I hope this information impacts your work one way or another. And if you can spread the message, I'd be absolutely grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercy Mutemi. Thank you very much.